Thank you so much for the invitation to join you again. It's an honor to be invited the first time, but I feel like it's very special to be invited back into a community. So that is very special for me. So thank you for having me back and yeah, getting to talk about post-plagiarism and academic integrity. So this is my research area. And as Maha mentioned, I tend to scaffold my thinking a little bit, and I'll talk about that a little bit in the session today, but to kind of set the stage a little bit. Wanted to ensure that I'll have the chat open and I welcome you to participate in the chat throughout. I think this is in line with other Equity Unbound events that I've participated in as a participant and a presenter. So you engaging through it and sharing your ideas and challenges, challenges to my thinking as well is also very helpful. Wanted to start in a good way by recognizing that I'm joining you today and paying tribute to the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta, which is where I'm located in Calgary. I'll show you a map in just a minute in case your geography of Canada is a little fuzzy. I know that sometimes when I travel to different places, I have a general idea, and then to help someone locate in their space helps me to orient to where they are. So I'm in the province of Alberta in the city of Calgary, which is includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, who include the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations. And the city where I live, the city of Calgary, is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Districts 5 and 6. Yes, as Maha mentioned in the meeting chat, if you live in a place where land acknowledgements, territorial acknowledgements are part of what you do to honor the Indigenous peoples where you are, please feel free to add yours in the chat. So, as I mentioned, I'm joining you today from Calgary, from the Western province of Alberta, where I live and work. And on this slide, you may be able to see the map is in gray, and I need to probably do a better job next time with the star so it stands out a little bit more. But on the second to left province is a yellow star near the bottom of the province. That's to indicate the city of Calgary, which is best known for two things. One is the annual Calgary Stampede, which is a summer festival that we have to celebrate rodeo culture, Western culture, cowboy, cowgirl culture. And the other thing that Calgary, of course, is known for was the 1988 Olympics. And so as well, you'll see my research partner there looking over my shoulder. That's one of my cats, Georgie. We have two of them, and Georgie often accompanies me on these intellectual journeys. So that's a little bit about me and where I'm living, where I come from. I've been in Calgary for over 30 years, so it's home now. This also helps me to kind of situate in this work because the academic integrity that we'll talk about is culturally and contextually bounded. So I'll start by saying that I acknowledge that the work that I do is framed within these cultural boundaries. So I may say some things today that may or may not resonate with you depending on where you're from. And it might be an opportunity to reflect on the cultural and contextual bounding of your understandings of academic integrity and plagiarism and post-plagiarism. So Maha mentioned the provenance of this work. Today's talk is framed within three books. Maha mentioned you have plagiarism in higher education in your library. So that was the 2021 book where the notion of post-plagiarism first kind of occurred to me. And it was in response, we have these ongoing dialogues, either in real time or through our reading with other scholars. And my work has been pretty heavily influenced by a plagiarism scholar who's now retired, and her name is Rebecca Moore Howard. I'll talk a little bit about her later on. But in her work and framing as plagiarism, Rebecca Moore Howard, Professor Howard, is now a professor emerita at Syracuse University. She's a compositionist and works a lot with students who speak English as an additional language, who in the United States would be international students very often, and was really perturbed and distressed by the kind of discrimination and racism against students learning English as an additional language, particularly when it came to plagiarism, and advocated in some of her early work in the 90s and 2000s that we should just take the word plagiarism and throw it out of our policies. One of the titles of one of her articles is "Don't Police, Just Teach." And she really advocated for, I think, what we would call today compassionate pedagogy. But back in those days, that framing wasn't used, and her ideas were considered a little bit radical around plagiarism. But she's really heavily influenced my work because I started thinking about, well, what if we reframed our thinking around it? And then when artificial intelligence came on the scene, that's when I started thinking about post-plagiarism. So that's just kind of a little bit about the provenance of the work, some of the scholars who've influenced me. And if you're interested in sort of research and scholarship around plagiarism, I recommend Becky Moore Howard's work because it was very insightful for me and very helpful, and continues to be. I go back and I reread her work and learn new things each time. So in terms of our time together here today, just wanting to acknowledge, I mean, we've got these massive topics around Gen AI, and I know you've talked about this in this community before. We won't be able to tackle all of the concerns around Gen AI. It's too much for any one session or even one series. And we know that the conversations will be ongoing. And we also know that as people work in the field, that their thinking evolves over time. And so just recognizing that where we were with this 2 years ago may not be where we are today. So we're going to focus today on academic integrity, plagiarism, and post-plagiarism for artificial intelligence. And I also just kind of wanted to say that I tend to scaffold. So as Maha mentioned in her very kind introduction, I will think about something and then take it away, digest it, come back, refine it. So you may see some slides that you've seen in other presentations, and there's new things, because I like to kind of involve the folks that I work with in community sort of in my process as I learn and grow as a scholar and a teacher. And so inviting you to come along that journey with me, that includes some work that I've done before and some new work. So much of the framing around academic integrity is changing globally. And one of the projects that I worked on in the past couple of years, I guess, is the second handbook of academic integrity. The first handbook was led by a scholar named Tracy Brettag, who's passed away, and I got a chance to work on the second one. I was the editor-in-chief, worked with a team of 9 section editors, so they were like the team leads, and collectively we have 112 chapters in the handbook from 145 authors all over the world. Part of my job was to read the handbook, read all of the chapters, and then draw a through line. And this was one of those times when I had to sit with it because the through line didn't seem evident to me across what became a 3-volume book. But as I sat with it, this framework around comprehensive academic integrity emerged. This kind of synthesizes some of the main ideas in the handbook. And I have a colleague in Canada and British Columbia who calls this the colorful swirly donut of integrity. His name's Kieran Ford, so I'll give him a shout out at the University of British Columbia. So I'll take you through this to kind of show you how some of the global thinking around academic integrity is changing, because I think it can be relevant to our conversations about teaching, learning, and supporting students. So using Kieran's idea of swirls, we can look on the right-hand side at the orange swirl, a yellow-orange swirl in student academic conduct. This is kind of, at least in North America, a historical framing around academic integrity, student cheating, student examination cheating, plagiarism, those kinds of things. And we know that student life is different than it was in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, even the 90s. And students are being invited into spaces where they weren't in decades past, particularly around things like research. Many universities now will have undergraduate research programs or opportunities for students, and more master's and doctoral students will be expected to publish and present in their graduate programs or postgraduate programs, depending on that vocabulary nomenclature, depending where you live. So the idea of bringing students into publication ethics and research integrity and ethics is important now compared with generations past, because this is also part of a student experience, even at the undergraduate level. And so these become important topics related to academic integrity. So we can't really decouple research integrity from academic integrity anymore. And nor can we decouple instructional ethics from academic integrity in thinking about educator responsibilities for ethical assessment, which is another big piece of the puzzle, probably its own piece of the puzzle, its own swirl here. Too big to think about today, but thinking about the role of educators in assessment with regards to academic integrity. So one of the things that we might talk about, for example, with AI, you may have heard of a practice called white texting. I'm not sure if folks here would have learned, or you might know it by another name, where this happened, I think, in the early days of ChatGPT, but as I understand from talking with some colleagues, still happens, in which an instructor would set an assignment in Word, for example. They'd write up the assignment instructions in Word, and somewhere in that document, they would embed some ridiculous text. So let's say your assignment was about, I don't know, physics, but in the assignment, they would embed the text, kangaroos dancing. But then they would take the text, change it to white font, and make it very small so that someone looking at a Word document couldn't see it. But if students copy and paste the instructions into an LLM, like ChatGPT, for example, and ask the AI app to do their homework for them, that the result would contain the ridiculous words like kangaroos dancing, which obviously would have nothing to do in a physics assignment. And then the instructor would be able to say, aha, gotcha. You cheated because unless you had used one of these apps or cut and pasted, then you wouldn't have kangaroos dancing in your physics assignment. These kind of assessment tactics are often considered controversial at best, deceptive, and covert, and so may serve to exacerbate antagonistic or adversarial relationships with students. So thinking about the ways that we can demonstrate our academic integrity through ethical assessment rather than tactics that might focus on a gotcha opportunity for an educator, and thinking about ways that we can really challenge and resist those approaches that are largely punitive in nature. And then, of course, thinking about institutional and ethical leadership, and then students who work or live and study in institutions that might be corrupt. And we know that academic integrity is often only seen to do with academics, but can in some contexts include other expectations, bribery, in some places, sex for grade schemes that necessarily affect the integrity of the overall educational ecosystem. More and more in the handbook, what we were seeing was scholars and experts and pedagogues calling for an integrated and holistic approach to academic integrity, where we could talk about all of these things, since the word integrity itself means to make whole, and thinking about academic integrity as a foundation for ethical decision-making in everyday life. It doesn't mean that we're perfect, doesn't mean that we never make mistakes. We all make mistakes every day. But this idea of having an opportunity and a space to practice and ask questions. When I say practice, I mean practice ethical decision-making, whatever that might mean in a context, so that at the end, we as professionals are demonstrating our ethical decision-making at the same time as we're cultivating students into ethical professionals or members of society themselves. So this framing is really an evolution and a challenge to historical definitions that really pit students against teachers, or students against the administration, or sometimes teachers against the administration. Thinking about the way that we can take this holistic view around academic integrity. Now this, our handbook does have some chapters on artificial intelligence. It wasn't the focus of the handbook. It contained all kinds of different topics, but this thinking came from writers and contributors all over the world. And maybe I'll just shift back to, thank you, Caroline, for sharing that, that resource there. Maybe one thing I'll just do here is talk a little bit about kind of one of my pet peeves, which is when people misuse the phrase academic integrity. So during COVID, I put together this timeline with a couple of grad students, and it was published in an article that we wrote on the connections between mental well-being, mental health, and academic integrity, and really tried to sort of disentangle some of the language that's used. When I hear people say, I'm dealing with a case of academic integrity, or I'm investigating academic integrity, it really gets on my nerves because we don't investigate or deal with integrity. We should celebrate integrity and promote it. And it's about education and skill building and helping students bring the best of themselves to our learning spaces. But as an educator, there might come that moment, that critical incident of a moment where you either know or suspect that there's been a breach of integrity. So thinking about the language and the words that we use around a breach of integrity or a violation of integrity, which in many contexts could just be called academic misconduct. And then if in this moment as an educator, you're like, oh, something's gone wrong here, what do I do? Thinking about this gray area here for educators because it's often a moment that can create a lot of emotional distress for the educator. And this is not acknowledged very much in the literature, but the literature that we have found showed that educators may experience pretty high levels of stress when they find they have to report an incident of misconduct. They may or may not know how to report it. They may or may not want to report it for a variety of reasons. They may not want to jeopardize the student's future, or they may not want repercussions from an administrator who might not support them. Or if they're precariously employed, they may fear for job loss if they are labeled as a troublemaker. And so there's psychological impact for educators, emotional labor that's involved in this process. But then we move into this area or this part of the continuum where it's academic misconduct. And I'll talk a little bit more about these breaches of integrity in just a moment and how we frame them in some of our understandings around academic integrity. But this is basically, okay, we think something's gone wrong. We initiate an investigation or a case management. There might be a hearing or a sanction, and later on there might be an appeal around that. And so there's these different processes at different ends of the continuum. So I just kind of wanted to frame our conversation today by starting with the idea of academic integrity as something to be celebrated, whereas academic misconduct is something to be addressed or investigated, and not whitewashing these terms out of for political correctness. And so you'll hear me use these two different terms, academic integrity and academic misconduct, in my work. But for people who do work in the academic misconduct side of the house, if you will, it can be kind of soul-crushing work for those who have a heavy administrative load around investigations and case management. And it can seem that the percentage of students who don't cheat is quite small, and that people who intentionally cheat, students who intentionally cheat are the majority. And even some of the research that exists over a period of time will say that 50 to 90% of undergraduate students might engage in misconduct. So this kind of bell curve has kind of a skewed bias in terms of perception. And then when we look at what the research might show about cheating in general and cheating in society, we can actually see that the bell curve is a normal bell curve. And at one end of the continuum, we have a small percentage of outlier students who never cheat. Bless them. And we wish most students were like them. And at the other end of the continuum, we have students, a small percentage, who may intentionally and maliciously cheat, but these are also a minority. And in these cases, we may have students that show little remorse, are unwilling to take responsibility, and no matter what we do, they keep cheating. But it's a small percentage. And in the middle of this bell curve, we have the students who are normal. 80 to 90% of students who, if you put them in a difficult situation at a difficult time, they may make a wrong decision. They may make a misstep. And I tell people on this bell curve, I would be normal. I remember cheating when I was 8 years old in school and I copied from an Encyclopedia Britannica and my teacher didn't catch me. I still remember doing it, mostly because I never got caught and I was surprised. But I was looking at something, it was a geography assignment, and I thought, I can't say it any better than this, so I just copied it. So in that case, I felt insecure about my academic abilities. I felt like somebody else had said it better. I was afraid that if I tried to say it in my own words, I wouldn't get as good a mark or I might fail. So there was other things going on, right, in my head. And some of the research that we have around academic misconduct will show that by and large, when students engage in cheating behaviors, it's not because they're bad people, but because they may have made a poor decision or a bad decision at a moment in time. So thinking about academic integrity as a behavior or as a moral construct, and these are different ways of looking at academic integrity. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. But before I do, just wanted to acknowledge that these definitions that we talk about, there are no universal definitions of academic integrity or plagiarism or misconduct. Our definitions are culturally and contextually and historically bound. And so understanding what we're talking about. And some years back, I looked at policies from Canadian universities, 20 different universities. I looked at their academic misconduct policies and compared their definitions of plagiarism. There was some consistency, usually copying text verbatim, considered plagiarism. That's no surprise. Plagiarism of ideas, stealing other people's ideas, also not a surprise. Difficult to prove that one in an investigation. But some universities, for example, included in their definitions copying and pasting others' computer code, whereas some universities did not include that in their definition of plagiarism. Some included things such as musical composition or design, whereas other universities did not. So what struck me there was a lack of consistency in policy definitions, and yet we all think we're talking about the same thing when we say plagiarism. So being able to understand and unpack, like, what do we mean when we say that? This is one of the reasons with ChatGPT and other AI apps that it's so difficult to understand the idea of plagiarism when it comes to using apps like ChatGPT, because even before ChatGPT hit the market, we still didn't have consistency. And then when we look at how conversations across places might differently define these, we find that it can get messy very quickly. So one thing I might invite you to do is in the meeting chat is think about at your institution. One, do you know how concepts like plagiarism are defined? And have you had debates with colleagues about what might or might not constitute misconduct? So I'll give you an example for plagiarism. I have colleagues who say that if a student misses a page number when they're citing something directly from a text, that's plagiarism. Or if they fail to use quotation marks, that's plagiarism. And I have other colleagues who say, no, that's a typo. The student forgot the quotation marks. That's not plagiarism. It might be sloppy scholarship, but it's not plagiarism. So what are your thoughts on this? What are your ideas about plagiarism, what is and isn't, and their institutional definitions? So it might be a good place to start when you're having these conversations with folks about what do we mean when we say plagiarism? But also, we talked a little bit about the behaviors and values of morality. I wanted to present a couple of cultural framings around academic integrity that may or may not resonate with you and where you are, but to kind of set a framing around this. And I'll do this in an agnostic way. I don't necessarily subscribe or connect with all of these framings, but some of them are quite predominant in the literature. So for example, the International Center for Academic Integrity has these fundamental values that they talk about of courage, honesty, fairness, trust, respect, and responsibility. And these framings have been, they actually updated them. Courage was added, I think, in 2014. They originally started with 5 fundamental values and then came up to 6. Some have challenged this framework, saying we could include other ones. I have colleagues in Mexico who are very adamant that compassion should be added as a fundamental value of academic integrity. ICI hasn't taken that up yet. And I've argued that dignity should be included as a value for academic integrity. And that also hasn't been taken up. But this idea of a framework around values. So this is very dominant in US-based conversations around academic integrity. And because we're geographically close, has made its way into policy discourse in Canada and other places as well. Before I mentioned the handbook of academic integrity, one of the chapters that I did in that was with a colleague by the name of Teddy Fishman. And Teddy and I, as we were both teaching in Turkey in 2022 at an academic integrity summer school there at Çanakkale Ansiklizmart University. And we started having these conversations about the differences between academic integrity in the United States and in Canada. And lots of people think that they're the same. But in fact, we have quite different framings around academic integrity. And so this led us to sort of examine some of the literature. There's a large body of literature on this from the United States. And we found sort of two dominant discourses in American-based academic integrity writing. One was from folks who are largely affiliated with the International Center for Academic Integrity and those 6 fundamental values. And it's about values and morality and character education and character development. And this idea that if we can cultivate a person's morals, then we can cultivate good behavior. So the idea of morals leading to behavior, this is nothing new. This has existed in psychology for a long time. And you can see lots of the sort of the dominant scholars from this school of thought, if you will, Tricia Bertram-Gallant, Don McCabe, David Rettinger. But there was a different discourse happening at the same time. And that was a group of people, and I mentioned Rebecca Moore Howard earlier, and so I've been influenced by her work. And some of her colleagues, Sandra Jamieson, Lisa Panning Davies, Amy Robillard, they say academic integrity and plagiarism have nothing to do with morality. Let's take the morality out of it. Let's focus on behavior and specifically academic skill development, because we can focus better on developing somebody's academic skills when the question about whether or not they're a good person doesn't come into play. Thanks, Maha, for posting the link there. So this was really interesting for us because Rebecca Moore Howard and Don McCabe were contemporaries in the United States at the same time, both doing the bulk of their writing in the 1990s and early 2000s. Don McCabe was in the state of New Jersey. Rebecca Moore Howard was across the state border line in New York, and they never worked together. As far as I know, they never had any debates or conversations. And Don McCabe passed away before I got a chance to talk with him about it. But I did ask Rebecca Moore Howard, I'm like, did you ever work with Don McCabe or have a chance to talk with him about his ideas? And she said no, that they were basically two different camps. I know it may be hard to imagine polarized thinking around the United States, but it happens, even with academic integrity. So the two of them never had conversations. I think that's kind of a shame that they were never able to at least debate their ideas around this. But we had these two polarized skills, right? Yeah. So I might ask you, when you think about academic integrity and plagiarism, do you think it's about morality, or do you think it's about academic skills and behavior? Or is it both? I think in Canada, probably it's a little bit of both, but probably less on the values and morality, right? Maybe depends on the context. Yeah. So these are the one framing, culturally and contextually bound. And wanted to highlight, some of the work we do in Canada and give a shout out to a friend and colleague here, Kita Gladue. Kita is an Indigenous scholar from the Sucker Creek Cree Nation, and also finds her roots in the Métis Nation of Manitoba. And she did a project at the University of Calgary around Indigenous academic integrity, sort of challenging these colonial norms that we've developed. And she developed this iconography at the top with the braid, and the 3 colors each have a different symbolic meaning, and I forget what they are, but I think blue is meant to represent the prairie sky and yellow is meant to represent wheat, and I forget what the orange one is. I'll have to ask her. But Kita talks about academic integrity quite differently, and she talks about relationality as being fundamental to academic integrity, and I am because you are. and I am because of those who came before me, on whose shoulders I stand and who I've learned from. And she said, relationships don't merely shape reality, they are reality, drawing from Sean Wilson's work there, another Indigenous scholar. And she also talks about reciprocity and the roles we serve, and inherent in the commitment to the people is the understanding of reciprocity of life and accountability to one another. I loved this. The accountability to one another as being prioritized over an accountability for rule compliance. This was a very different framing. And when Kita did this project in 2020 and 2021, there was nothing else like it for academic integrity at the time. And then finally, she also talks about respect, but in a very different way from the American framing of respecting the rules, respecting your teacher, respecting the authority, but rather respect as nothing about us without us, and engaging, in this case, Indigenous persons in conversations about integrity, and engaging students in conversations about integrity. And here she draws from Smith's work and says, Indigenous knowledge extends beyond the environment. However, it has values and principles about human behavior and ethics, about relationships, about wellness, and leading a good life. Knowledge has beauty and can make the world beautiful if used in a good way. I sat with that for a long time. Knowledge is beautiful. And it made me step back and think about how can we think about academic integrity as a way of teaching our students of the beauty of knowledge. And that may be aspirational, but when I talk about post-plagiarism, these are some of the concepts I'm thinking about as we engage in understandings, or maybe our evolution around academic integrity. So we asked this reflection question a little bit earlier. How are the concepts around academic integrity and plagiarism and cheating defined or understood in your context? And to what extent might concepts such as relationality and reciprocity and respect for one another and the beauty of knowledge be part of those conversations? And much of the discourse that still exists around academic integrity, it's around rule compliance and catching cheaters. I'm not sure that I can reconcile that idea with emphasizing the idea of respecting knowledge, because knowledge is beautiful and it exists because we exist in relation to one another, and knowledge doesn't exist outside of us as humans, or does it? This is a big question we might grapple with as we think about evolving understandings of plagiarism and artificial intelligence. I've talked about this framework before, so I won't spend too much time on it today, but suffice to say that as I sat with Rebecca Moore Howard's challenge to throw out plagiarism from our policy definitions, focus on teaching, I thought, what could replace it? What could replace plagiarism? And I kind of got stuck because there is sort of no replacement for plagiarism that I could think of. And I thought, what if we transcended it in the age of AI? What would that look like? So this became a conceptual framework, and it was a thinking point. And I wanted to give a shout out here to my colleague Rahul Kumar has actually taken this framework, and he shared his work with me, and I'm thrilled that he did it. It's just being published now. But he took these 6 tenets of plagiarism and the sentences within them, he called them constructs, and then he developed a survey around them and surveyed people around each of them to say, do you agree with them? Do you disagree with them? Do you think this is true? And so on. And the idea of human AI writing becoming normal, a hybrid action in which we can co-create with AI. And I know that others have talked about co-creation, even co-intelligence with AI, but the idea of writing being constructed such that in the end, we may not know where the AI begins or ends. We may not know where the human begins or ends. And is that important to us? In the end, it may not be important. And this was me also trying to think in the future, being future forward, and what might future generations face. And having a background in literature, when I went to university, we were allowed to use typewriters. We were allowed to handwrite our papers. We were not allowed to use computers. And if a paper was turned in that looked like it had been done on a computer, word processor, which at the time, I'm dating myself now, but bear with me, had paper down the sides. You may remember this if you're around my age, that you had to pull away because it had all these little dots on it from the printer, right? And you pulled away those perforated edges. So the teachers could tell if your paper came from one of those printers because of the edges on it, and they wouldn't accept the papers because they felt that interacting with a word processor or a computer would interfere with our intellectual ability to engage with the literature text we were stealing. Yes, dot matrix printer, that's it. It was it. That's it. And so they wouldn't accept it. We'd have to go back and rewrite it. So this idea of like what was acceptable when I was a student, what was not acceptable, what is acceptable today with students, and thinking ahead to next generations. And this doesn't exist within the Indigenous cultures in Western Canada as much as it does in Eastern Canada. So I'll just acknowledge Indigenous cultures as not being a monolith. But in the Eastern Canadian and North American contexts, in some Indigenous cultures like Ojibwe and Anishinaabe, there's the idea of thinking 7 generations ahead and thinking and planning for the earth and the learning and the people, not for the people of today or even the people of tomorrow, but of 7 generations ahead. I was thinking about that when I thought about post-plagiarism. What might things look like 7 generations from now? Of course, I have no answer, but it helped me to think about the ways in which technology may or may not affect things like creativity, our human ability to create and inspire others, how it may or may not help us overcome language barriers. And Maha was very instrumental in helping me refine my thinking around this tenet. And then when it comes to misconduct, the idea right now of humans being accountable for the work that we submit to teachers, to bosses, to journals, and we are responsible for the content. And so we can relinquish some of the control if we want to an AI app to help us, to assist us, but we don't relinquish control or responsibility. We can relinquish some control, but not responsibility. In the end, the work that our students submit to us is their responsibility. Just as the work that we submit to journals as scholars is our responsibility. So the idea of being really clear about outsourcing as a relinquishing of control, and whether the outsourcing is to a person or an AI, but we're not relinquishing or outsourcing responsibility. So we don't outsource accountability in that sense. So this is crucial for academic integrity, and that attribution remains important. And the more that I do plagiarism work, the more annoyed I get with the technical minutiae of citing and referencing according to prescribed systems. I grew up with these. I grew up with having to learn MLA because I was in humanities. And then I went to education where I had to learn APA. And that was kind of an academic trauma in a way, because I sort of had to unlearn and disavow, if you will, everything to do with MLA and take up this new citing and referencing system around API and memorize the rules. And I was really lousy at it for a long time. And then, of course, you get new editions and there's new rules, right? And the great debate, if you were also trained in APA, and I think it was between editions 5 and 6 or 6 and 7, where, oh my goodness, the number of spaces after a period became a okay, we're back. We're back. Yeah, I'm just thinking back to the difference between attribution and giving somebody recognition for their work has, in a way, the ethos of attribution and seeking the provenance of our knowledge has very little to do with things like how many periods there are, or how many spaces there are after a period, or whether we're using sentence case or title case capitalization. And I feel like in some ways the minutiae, the technical aspects of citing and referencing get elevated, and the ethos of attribution gets minimized as a way of punishing students if they don't know the rules. So if we can rethink the idea of plagiarism as a way of insisting on attribution and thinking about this relationality of knowledge being in relation to one another and knowledge being beautiful, attribution becomes a joy rather than the mundane frustration of the technical aspects of citing and referencing. So these skills will remain no doubt important, but I think what I'm suggesting is that we stop punishing students for technical errors with citing and referencing, and instead, if focus on the ethos of attribution. So if a student has for example, forgotten quotation marks, we can guide them formatively and say, you've forgotten your quotation marks here. This is one of our conventions, and I know that you didn't mean to dishonor the person whose work you're drawing from, so let's just put the quotation marks around it. How much kinder would that be then? You dock 20 marks for your APA errors. There are kinder, gentler, more compassionate ways to teach people the ethos of attribution. But finally, thinking about the ways where the definitions of plagiarism, historical definitions, may no longer apply because of some of the complexities and the shifting landscape. What I would like to say, when we think about post-plagiarism, is in our era in which our advanced technologies, our AI apps, are a normal part of life. But that doesn't mean that we always like them, that they are, or that they're unproblematic, that at least for the foreseeable future, I can't imagine that there would be a lack of problematization with these, that we should continue to think about the ethical constructs, and again, beyond what we've been able to talk about today, but that the ideas around punishment for lack of rule compliance for things like technical minutiae may need to give way if we want to have some deep understandings and conversations about the ethics of working with these AI apps. We're not there yet, I don't think. I think the jury is still out, but already what we are seeing is that these historical definitions of plagiarism and misconduct they may require questioning and consideration. Because the idea of the crime and punishment approach may actually not be helpful to students in terms of their learning. So let me ask you this, and I invite your participation in the chat here. What are some maybe timeless or evergreen ideas about integrity that we should keep? Because there's a lot about integrity, being whole, being respectful of others' work, that is worthwhile keeping, and what might we want to evolve or move away from, because education develops, assessment develops, teaching and learning develops, and that things they don't always have to stay the way they were. So I mentioned last week that I was doing some work in Ireland and having conversations there with colleagues my age, some a little bit older, who told me that when they were in school, that corporal punishment was part of their everyday life when they were in elementary and secondary school, and they grew up with corporal punishment as part for misbehavior, so getting the strap or getting the cane. And I said, well, in Canada, I attended a school where we were taught by one nun who would come and smack the ruler on the desk. She wouldn't beat us. She would smack the ruler on the desk or the pointer on the desk, and it was enough to scare us and give us the idea that, oh yeah, no, it's something that there was kind of this act there. But for some people, punishment, physical punishment, is still part of their daily life or reality in their educational context. And that, I think, there's a little bit of a punishment hangover, if you will, when it comes to academic integrity and plagiarism. And you're getting some Foucault vibes now. Cool. Thank you for that. The acknowledging where your ideas are seeded and blossom and grow, that's evergreen. That is phenomenal. Thank you for sharing that. Really appreciate it. So thinking about things like how might we move away from punishment in the same way that corporal punishment has been banned in many places now, but not all. So this is an evolution that's happened in educational systems. I like to think of a wraparound approach to academic integrity as a challenge to historical approaches where it was good guys and bad guys, or students against teachers, right? But if instead we put the students at the heart of what we're doing, holding them accountable for the decisions, holding them accountable for their behavior, but also recognizing responsibilities of educators to act ethically, and teaching assistants, and the institutional leaders for setting the expectations for integrity around policy. Of course, there will continue to be consequences for bad behavior. There's a misstep. We can correct the misstep. I'd like to suggest that we can do that in a way where we can preserve an individual's dignity, and that we might not necessarily have to make an assumption of them being a bad person. There will always be the outliers on the bell curve. Thinking about the role of professional staff in this, and professional staff have different roles in different places around academic integrity. and then bringing in that idea of academic integrity as a foundation for ethical decision-making in life. What might be the role of government ministries, industries, professional bodies, thinking about ethical decision-making in the professions. So we can take a little bit of a different approach to minimize these antagonistic or adversarial approaches. To do that, we might need to think about the ways that we address misconduct. I mean, it's sort of got these three sort of methods, traditional methods. One is a quite punitive method. It's basically a crime and punishment approach there. And there's some Foucault for you. The sanctions should be fair. They should fit the offense. There's a progressive discipline model. And what I mean by that is first offense, minimal punishment. Second and subsequent approaches get increasingly or more severe punishments, right? With the ultimate one being expulsion, called exclusion, depending where you are. But basically, when they've decided that you're so bad, you're beyond any help, and you must be ejected from the system. This is pretty easy to monitor and track, so institutions tend to like it because it's very transactional. And then there's another approach that often is layered on top, an educational approach where students may be offered remedial or rehabilitative workshops, academic remediation around citing, referencing, paraphrasing. Our university, for example, has a combination of this punitive and educational approach. And actually had a conversation with a previous vice provost for Brown policy because there was the possible sanctions or punishments that could result from a finding of academic misconduct. And one of those was mandatory workshops at the Student Success Center for citing and referencing. And I said, this is listed under some possible punishments for academic misconduct. But we're an institution of learning. In my opinion, under no circumstances should learning be a punishment. So I challenged her to reframe the language there to consequences or outcomes, that an outcome of a plagiarism finding, for example, could be mandatory attendance at a remediation workshop. Shouldn't be listed as a punishment. Taking a workshop and learning how to do something shouldn't be a punishment because you've been found responsible of misconduct. So even thinking about the language that we use while still holding people accountable. And more, there has been increasing interest around restorative resolutions and restorative practices, which is a more community-based approach seeking to repair harm in relationships. It's a more relational way to address misconduct. Also used in some legal and judicial systems, for example, in Canada. Doesn't work in all cases. An individual must be willing to take responsibility for their actions. So for those at the other end of the bell curve who are unwilling to take responsibility, a restorative resolution won't work. In that case, you may still need a punitive approach. So the idea of having different options available from an administrative perspective to address misconduct may help to cultivate students as whole, complete individuals. And the idea question posed in the chat here around accountability is of equal importance as building trust, but what does accountability look like? Can never be policing, but it's rooted more in care and consideration. Yes, thank you for this. I appreciate the comment. And one thing that really strikes me about a restorative resolution for an academic misconduct or non-academic misconduct is the idea that the ultimate outcome of that process might not be to eject someone from the system, because a restorative resolution starts with the question of what will it take to keep you in our system in a way that we can trust you and you can trust us and we can be together in community going forward. When you think about that, it turns the response to academic misconduct on its head. And instead of thinking about you must be punished, you must be excommunicated, to use culturally sensitive language there, but rather you are part of this community, you matter, we want you to continue to be part of this community, and we would like to work with you. And to do that, we will look at repairing the harm. So this is a resource-intensive approach. It requires funding for people to receive some training and different ways of approaching misconduct. It can be time-intensive, but it can also be, in the end, a more effective way to reduce repeat offenses and help to guide students sort of along the ethical decision-making as a practice to be built over time. Um, yes, and a great question here from Mahabali is, should we ever also turn around and ask, what does it take for our community to be more welcoming of you? This is an important question that I'm not sure I've ever heard in any North American context in the university around academic misconduct. So I will give you attribution, Maha, when I take your question forward and bring it into conversations with colleagues here. I think it's a really important question to think about the relationality there. So ultimately, when we're thinking about assessments and the roles that we can play with assessments, we do want assessments to be aligned with course outcomes and program goals, and in some cases, workforce needs. Now, my colleagues in the humanities find that objectionable, but that's fine. You can still take that out and think program goals as relating to societal expectations and the kinds of citizens that we would like our graduates to be. Of course, the parchment that they receive at the end needs to represent the learning that they've done. And for that to happen, then we know that if people have cheated their way through school or plagiarized, then they may not, it may not represent the learning. But to kind of think about the next evolution of all of this, colleagues are now starting to ask me about the ethics of AI-powered assessment tools. So I've heard colleagues say, well, if students can use ChatGPT for their essays, and that's maybe not plagiarism, maybe it is, how can I use AI assessment tools to evaluate my students? And I can say, I'm conflicted about this. Um, there may be increased efficiencies in grading and feedback, especially with large classes. There may be potential for more frequent assessments as we have AI apps engage with us. If we're co-creating the writing, can we be co-creating assessment with AI? I'm struggling with this idea. I'd be interested to hear your ideas around it. Can AI help us with consistency across large groups, or provide sort of personalized learning paths for students based on assessment data and algorithms and outputs and analysis of that data? And is there 24/7 availability for our students? Because as educators, as human educators, we are not available 24/7, right? We need to sleep. And that we might have teacher reduced workload around assessment. These are some things that have come out in some of the literature that I've looked at, and we might be able to identify patterns in student performance that at scale, and then be able to address those. The jury's out for me in terms of the utility of AI-powered assessment tools and the ethics of that. My thinking may evolve. I'm hoping that as I sit with this and think with it more over time, and maybe have a chance to use some of the tools for assessment. And I don't work with large student groups, to be fair, right? I don't deal with mega lectures of 500 or 1,000 students at a time, because I teach mostly graduate courses and students. But my colleagues who teach the mega lectures have a tremendous burden on them in terms of the assessment and the amount of time. Is it possible that AI could help them with that? I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that one. Right now, I can say that I'm struggling with it, but I can see, if I'm thinking towards the future, 5 generations ahead, 2 generations ahead, 7 generations ahead, what role might AI be playing in terms of assessment for teaching and learning? That's a future that I can't yet possibly imagine, but I have a sense it's probably coming. So I wanted to put it on our radar today, because as we're talking about academic integrity, it's another important piece when we think about the instructional ethics in the colorful, swirly donut of integrity. And will this be ethical for us as instructors? I'm not sure. But because I'd like to end on something practical after kind of the big, heavy abstract thinking and philosophical bits, some practical tips. I know we're just about at time, so maybe I won't go through them all, but I'll pull on a couple of threads that I think are my favorite and I try and practice in my own teaching, and it's to provide the clear guidelines around AI. And I know that folks here have heard this, have probably preached this before, Um, and then also, I would say as well, encouraging open discussions about AI with students about coursework, rather than simply saying you can or you can't, but engaging our students as partners in that dialogue, knowing that these tools may be part of their future. And then finally, creating that culture of integrity through positive reinforcement and what is okay, what is not okay, and that we are ultimately here to help you build your skills. So this is a little bit of thinking that I'm having right now around post-plagiarism. Some of the thoughts are incomplete and they're in process. And one of the things I really appreciate about engaging with communities like this is the ability to have conversations and learn with and from each of you. Maybe before I end, I'll just give a shameless plug for an upcoming, it's the Distinguished Research Lecture at the University of Calgary. This is considered a once in a career kind of talk that someone's invited to give. And this year I've been invited to give it. So we're going to look at different topics around global trends in education and AI. And you're welcome to join us. It's will be live streamed as well as in person. So I'll end there, and I think we have some time to chat, Maha, and I'd welcome people to uh, engage in conversation as well. So maybe I'll let you guide me through those next steps.
Sure. So, folks, yeah, thank you so much, Sarah. This was amazing and always, always so rich and so many useful ideas in terms of actual practice, but also things to think about. And the chat has been quite active. If anybody would like to ask a question, I think you could go ahead and either raise your hand or type it in the chat, whatever you're more comfortable with. And if you don't have questions, let us know in the chat what stood out for you. Okay, so Huda wants to know, she'd love to hear your thoughts on how to shift the narrative to restoration and not punishment. And yeah, the link to the Workland Calgary
Uh,
talk or the conference in the chat,
sure.
please.
Yeah, I'll pull the QR code up again, where I'll maybe share some more thoughts on the restoration and not punishment. I will say, I mean, these are sometimes considered quite radical conversations, even on my own campus, as an advocate for academic integrity, and asking my administration to possibly consider restorative approaches, because we're so entrenched somehow in these ideas that if we don't punish students for their misbehavior, that somehow like plagiarism becomes like a gateway to full-on corruption. And that may be true in very few cases, right? So the idea of like, we don't actually have an evidence base to support that in the research, right? That more often than not, it may be due to things such as circumstances. Maybe some of them are within students' control or outside students' control. And in my university, for example, we have priorities around decolonization and indigenization, and thinking about the ways that student conduct in colonized countries anyway is like the last bastion for decolonization. We talk about decolonizing the curriculum. We talk about decolonizing assessment and pedagogy. We haven't had very many conversations yet about decolonizing academic integrity. And I think it's a really important part of what we do, because so much of the punishment and I probably use this word is probably not the best choice of word, but I'm going to use it anyway. Like the violence that becomes integrated into our educational practices and taken for granted is something that I think the first step might be to just stop and question it. Like, do we really need it? And in terms of the plagiarism, of course, we want to hold students accountable. And there may be less violent ways of doing it. And so in more and more of the work I'm doing now, I'm focusing on things like human rights, which don't often factor into academic integrity policies. And the Council of Europe has a really great document around human rights by design for artificial intelligence. And it's about developing policies for artificial intelligence that take a human rights by design approach. And so at my university, I've also challenged us with our academic integrity policy, saying, how might we take a human rights by design approach? Because somehow it seems to be just taken for granted that we don't pay attention to students' dignity when there's a finding or an allegation of misconduct. And we just assume that if we're following procedural fairness and natural justice, that students may not find that humiliating. But in conversations with students, if they have been alleged of misconduct, the whole process can seem degrading and humiliating for them. And so the first step of, well, maybe one, asking students what would they like to see, knowing that, okay, the baseline is we're still going to hold misconduct, we're still going to hold people accountable for misconduct. But how can we do that in a way where we're preserving human dignity? That can be one place to start. So, okay, I'll stop sharing now. Maybe I hope that I'm not sure if that answered your question, but those are some thoughts I had to share on it.
Let me see what else we have in the chat. Okay, someone's saying thanks for the amazing session, lots to ponder, and they'll watch the recording one more time. I will too. Sarah, are you willing to share your slides as well? Or
Yeah, you bet. I'll send those over.
awesome, thank you. And Amani's saying, looking forward to the day when grading is no longer required. Yes, please. I've been
Mhm.
trying to, I've been talking about this for so long. But constructive instructional feedback is given by an AI tutor. No, you're looking forward to that? Okay, students can themselves generate AI feedback for their work based on provided rubrics. Yeah, and some have already been doing that and using that to help them improve before they submit. And they say it's been helping them. Depends on how good the rubric is, I think. The
Mm,
teacher role would be to teach, guide, mentor, support, role model, facilitate, engage students, scholars, brings to church. Thank you, Amani. So it's not a
mm.
question. I was waiting for the question. Sorry, I didn't read it before I read it out loud. So, yeah. Okay, Caroline from my department, what are your thoughts about involving students in policy making, spreading awareness, and discussions around academic integrity?
Yeah, thanks for this question. At our university, we have student government representatives that would be involved in policy revision and development, so that there is student representation and student voice. And there's a great infographic. I'll see if I can find it and pop it in the chat. It's not about academic integrity, but it's about engaging students as partners. And it's from an organization called Student Voice Australia, I think it was called. Let me see if I can find it. And it talks about this student engagement continuum. Okay, I have a general link here, and it's now looks like it's defaulted to a different one. So I will put it here, and maybe someone can help me find the exact link now because it seems to have moved. But they have this great continuum where they talk about how to engage students as partners, right? And so like a less desirable way might be simply keeping students informed. It's a one-way directional thing where we inform students. And then at the other end of this continuum was where students are actively involved in the decision making. So I wonder what a policy around academic integrity that students got to design and bring back to the administration, maybe as a first draft would look like. I don't know if a university, excuse me, that does that might be an interesting way to engage students. And we have every year we celebrate Academic Integrity Week, and we align it with the Carnegie Foundation's Global Ethics Day, which is the third Wednesday in October. And this year, one of our themes is we have two themes: artificial intelligence is one, and engaging students as partners is the other. And we have students on our planning committee as well, and student-led activities, games, and things around understanding and demystifying what is academic integrity so students can learn from their peers rather than a top-down. I mean, professors and administrators may not see themselves as scary, but sometimes students do. So having students talk with one another about what's important to them, and even simple things like, hey, did you know we have a policy? And or did you also know we have resources to help you? And here's some places that you can get those resources, I think can be really helpful for students. So the more we can involve students, then I think we can exemplify that nothing about us without us.
Speaking of nothing about us without us, Mia was asking if you have a reference for the seven generations ahead thinking as an Indigenous tradition. Is this specific to a particular Canadian Indigenous group or?
It actually it is throughout a number of different Indigenous cultures, but there was a resource from the University of Toronto called the Seven Grandfathers of Academic Integrity. Let me see if I can find it. And it's this idea of seven grandfathers, I think, behind us. And it was done by a woman by the name of Bonnie Maracle. And so I'll see if I can find, this is one resource that I like. So Toronto, of course, being, a few thousand kilometers to the east of us. And that might be helpful. And I think that the Seven Grandfathers teaching would be one place to start around that. And interestingly, this was the first resource that I became aware of in Canada around Indigenous views on academic integrity. And when I shared it with colleagues here, they said to me, they said, "Oh, it's good and it's useful, but it doesn't represent the Indigenous context of Western Canada." And so that led to conversations around how could we support the development of resources and knowledge around Western Canadian Indigenous nations' understanding of academic integrity. So that was key to Gladju's project. So understanding that there are differences even within Indigenous cultures.
Thanks, Sarah. Sorry, some people are texting me privately, so yeah, Hood is saying we're getting there in terms of co-creation with students, going back to the earlier point. And Hood posted a link about the Seven Grandfathers, integrity. So did Galera. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that name correct.
Yeah, it looks like a few. Oh, there's also the eCampus Ontario one. Thank you for that. Yeah, it looks like we've got a couple of the PDFs shared there. Terrific.
Okay, thanks. All right. Do we have any more questions or comments, Sarah? Okay, I think we'll wrap this up now. Thank you as always. And I can't wait for the slides to dig back in. I took a lot of screenshots while you were talking, and I'm sure, and lots of ideas for my class too, not just on the institutional level, but like what kind of conversations I can have in class with my students.
Oh,
Thank you.
awesome. Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me back. It's always a pleasure to be here with all of you. I'll make sure I
Likewise.
send those slides through right away.
Thank you. Have a good rest of your day. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. For the
Bye.
Take care. Bye bye.
Bye. Thank you.